On Thursday, May 9th of this year, first-year college student destroyer and conservative facts and logic man Ben Shapiro went on BBC News to do an interview with British conservative host Andrew Neil. At this point in time, about a full month later, I probably don't have to explain to you, dear viewer, how it went.
You purport to be an objective journalist. BBC purports to be an objective down-the-middle network. It obviously is not, it never has been, and you as a journalist are proceeding to call one side of the political aisle ignorant, barbaric, and sending us back to the dark ages. Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it.
The fallout from this event was pretty great, with even Ben Shapiro himself commenting on his destruction at the hands of Neil, and even apologized for coming into an interview supposedly unprepared. And while I can sit here and discuss each of the fine details of Shapiro and Neil's arguments, I'd rather shift the focus on something more pressing that this interview has revealed. There's a very clear formula that the right wing uses in their arguments and in their debates that I would like to point out here. We're going to look at one specific part of this interview, as well as his encounter with a socialist college student that happened a few months ago. First, let's watch the abortion argument with Andrew Neil.
Georgia, new abortion laws, which you are much in favor of. That a woman who miscarries could get 30 years. A Georgian woman who travels to another state for an abortion procedure could get 10 years. These are extreme hard policies.
Well, okay, a couple of things. One, I'm not sure, I mean, frankly, I don't know whether are you an objective journalist or are you an opinion journalist?
I'm a journalist that asks questions.
Okay, so you're a supposedly objective journalist calling policies with which you disagree barbaric and suggesting only one side of the political aisle has ideas. So I just want to point out that, I wish you would at least be honest in your own biases.
For some context, the question Neil is trying to raise here is whether or not Ben Shapiro still supports the Republican Party even if they have fallen into line with a president he supposedly did not support in 2016. As well as stating that it appears that only the Democratic Party is capable of new ideas right now, such as the Green New Deal. Shapiro's answer was incredibly stupid and foolish, as he tried to cover with the statement that the Republican Party does support new ideas, without actually giving any examples of what these ideas really are. Neil then responds by stating that the Georgia abortion law that was just passed regarding miscarriages and out-of-state abortions, which carry penalties of up to 30 years in prison, are barbaric and could bring us back to the Dark Ages. We'll talk about these laws in more details in another video. And Shapiro's response to this was to deflect with another question regarding Neil's standard of journalism, and it just all falls apart from there. Now, let's look at the very first question asked by the socialist college student. As an aside, I could not find a high enough quality video for this clip, so we are going to just stick with the audio here, and you can watch me play this cool video game in the background.
So my question is, I've seen your videos, I've seen you at other universities here talking about the immorality of socialism, and when you do, you focus on socialism as the idea of wealth redistribution, you know, taking from the rich, giving to the poor, taking from whoever, giving to whoever. But I think that ignores and that misses the point of what many socialists, myself and many of my comrades, see socialism as being. And in fact, what we see as integral, the debate of whether how much to redistribute wealth is a separate debate altogether, but the fundamental tenet of socialism is control of the means of production by the workers. The idea that a worker is entitled to the full product of their labor. This is manifested in the real world in the example of worker cooperatives, employee-owned businesses, and so on. So setting aside any notions of wealth redistribution, someone already asked about that, what is so immoral about believing that a worker is entitled to the full value of their labor, especially given that such enterprises organized in such a way have been shown to be more effective than traditionally capitalistically organized businesses?
Okay, so I think we have to separate out a couple of strands there. Number one, if you're going to talk about the efficacy of of workers owning the means of production, are we talking about the government owning the means of production, or are we talking about workers owning the means of production? Because if you're talking about the government, that is wildly untrue, the last statement that you just made, that it's effective. When the government owns the means of production, generally everything blows. Okay, that's actually the story of Cuba. That is the story of Venezuela. The democratic socialist countries of Norway are generally not owned, Norway is an exception in which the government owns a lot of stock in various companies, but those companies are run along free enterprise lines. They're not run along redistributionist lines, actually. And they also happen to have a massive sovereign oil wealth fund. But if you look at countries like Denmark, for example, there's still enormous private ownership of business. This is true in most of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries anyway. And if you're talking about workers owning a business together, I am a worker at my company. I own my business with another person who owns the company with me, and a couple of investors. The investors have sunk their labor, which they made money from. Right? Money is just a tangible trade for labor, and they took that money and they invested it in us. So is Bill Gates not a worker at his own company? He invented the company. So I'm also wondering how the worker is not owning his own labor when he freely chooses to alienate that labor in exchange for pay. My problem with socialism is that it is essentially somebody subjectively deciding the value of your own labor. The beautiful thing about the free market is that you don't get to subjectively decide what your labor is worth, right? You can't go major in something useless and then come to me and say, I want $100,000 a year for my useless major so I can dig holes in the ground, right? We all recognize that's stupid. The labor theory of value, which is that the amount of work you put into something dictates the value of the thing, is a bunch of crap. If I spend all day making mud pies outside, that's an awful lot of work. It's also completely useless. The way that you actually determine the value of work is by trading it for somebody else's work in a fully voluntary fashion. So if you're asking whether I'm okay with, for example, private sector unions, workers get together and they go to the owner and they say, we want more of the profit margin. Sure, as long as you're not kneecapping somebody, right? But if you kneecap somebody, then I don't approve of your means anymore. If you're asking me if a bunch of workers decide to get together and form a joint stock corporation, of course, that's how most corporations are formed. Most LLCs are formed this way. It's a couple of guys who get together, band their labor together. It's like two guys. And then, after it grows, they decide to hire other people. So we need to be very specific. When you talk about the ownership of the means of production, are you talking about my version, because that's called capitalism, or are you talking about where the government owns the means of production or crams down on voluntary associations' rules as to the means of production?
I'm talking about neither. I reject state socialism personally. What I'm referring to is specifically, for example, the term given is worker cooperatives. The most prominent example, the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, owned there is no investor or capitalist group that owns the profits. When the company turns a profit, that profit is distributed among the workers, some 80,000 employees. It's a wildly successful corporation.
Is it a voluntary association? Is there any cram down happening?
No, there's not.
Then good, it's capitalist. That's not socialist.
It's not.
In this clip, Ben Shapiro was asked a question regarding the morality of workers being entitled to the full value of their labor. To which Ben Shapiro asks an incredibly long-winded question regarding whether or not the discussion is government-owned means of production, i.e. the classic Cold War propaganda view of socialism, or the workers' ownership of the means of production, while mostly just talking about the failure of your classic Cubas and Venezuelas, and discussing social democracies like the Scandinavian model countries before finally getting to the actual point of the question. And even then, he still misrepresents the argument being made for worker co-ops by saying that they are still capitalist just because they participate in the market. Ben, I just have to ask, you do know what market socialism is, right? At any rate, discussion of market socialism will probably be a future video idea, as I myself would still like to do more research into such a system. The main point I am trying to make is that Ben Shapiro and many other conservatives like him always fall back to the strategy of deflecting questions with other questions and misrepresenting the arguments of their opponents. The strategy is simply not to look necessarily the smartest, but to have the strongest rhetoric. I look at this interview with this socialist student and see comments about how the kid had heart and eloquently explained the nuances of socialism, and I do agree with that somewhat. He did as good a job as he possibly could whilst not being on a stage with Shapiro, not having a receptive audience, and also having to ask for the mic if he wished to speak. But I see these comments, and then look at the overwhelming flood of comments saying that this kid was demolished, destroyed, etc. And I just see that the common person in the comments section, stream chat, or Twitter feed is not going to respond to completely civil, respectful rhetoric like this. I think the tactics the left wing needs to adopt if we wish to reach anyone are those of a slightly more aggressive nature, with actively calling out disingenuous statements, deflecting questions, and misrepresentations of arguments. We need to understand that this really is a battle of rhetoric. Thank you for sitting through this small analysis of rhetorical style. If you have stuck through to the end, your patience has been rewarded. In keeping with leftist solidarity and unity, I will be shouting out leftist streamers and YouTubers who either best exemplify the arguments made in my videos, or have also done insightful content regarding the subject matter of said videos. These creators will be all manner of different channel sizes and from many different walks of life. In today's video, I would like to call attention to Vosh, a streamer who I've derived a decent bit of entertainment from these past couple of months. He does an excellent job engaging in the rhetorical style I have discussed in this video. Go sub to him, comrades. And with that, I bid you all farewell.